Hello, everyone. Welcome to Life of a Researcher. Here we meet academic researchers and share their stories. We chat about what got them where they are and about what keeps them going. The hope is that these conversations will make the field of research accessible to young people. It will show how we can have very different starting points and yet land up forming a career as a researcher. Our guest today is someone I have known for almost a decade. She is presently a faculty member at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, India. In a way, she is a pukka academic researcher, in that she teaches courses, guides students, writes papers. But probably, this describes only one tenth of what she does. She gives public lectures, she writes articles in newspapers, she speaks for India at international climate summits, she sings songs, she brings up two legged and four legged creatures with equal love, and she basically infuses energy into everyone's life she touches. I'm very happy to welcome Tejal Kanetkar on this show today. Hi, Tejal.
I know them.
Hi. So it's a great pleasure, as I said, to have you on this show. And
Thank you very much.
I want to just get started this conversation with um, the starting point of Tejal in some sense. So, how did it all start when you were a student studying in school? Was it clear to you that you'll be like an academic researcher at some point?
So let me actually start with saying thank you for all those kind things that you said at the beginning. And to answer your question, it's actually very difficult to pinpoint where it all started. I wanted to be a mechanical engineer. In fact, I wanted to be an automobile engineer since the time I was in maybe higher secondary school. And this was because I had an uncle and a family friend who owned a garage and would let me sort of clean up the little machines, etc., when cars came in for repair, and I found it very fascinating. I was fairly okay at studies and maths and science. I found it fascinating, and so I took up higher education in the sciences and then eventually in engineering. However, as I moved along and did my master's, I started getting sort of more interested in interdisciplinary areas of work and not just purely sort of technical areas of research. And so that led me to exploring research as an option for the long term.
Okay, very nice. So that means initially the bent was kind of towards learning, experimenting, hands on things, but not so much maybe writing papers or something like this. Is that,
Absolutely,
yeah, because
absolutely,
that is not
yeah,
something that as a child we even perceive as a thing to do, right?
absolutely. Yeah, my daughter right now says that I don't do any work. I just sit in front of the computer and type.
that's
So,
that's usually the perception of a observer for most of us. Um, and then when interest started developing, you said that kind of your interest became multidisciplinary. So, can you kind of recall the phase in your life when this really happened? Like, oh, you suddenly felt that, oh, this one thing that I'm doing is sort of not enough? Or was it like a gradual process, or like, how was it?
so when I was doing my master's my funding basically came, I was doing my master's in the US. My funding came from the Department of Energy there to do energy audits in industries. And I was doing that. And it was very technical work. I was doing energy audits and things like that. But this was also a time when things were changing in the energy sector. The conversation about climate change was becoming much more open, much more widespread. Of course, it's reached a different level now than it was in those days. But there was already discussions on renewable energy, and I was working in a renewable energy and energy efficiency lab, for example. And so this exposed me to those conversations. And back home in India at that point, there were different kinds of transitions that were happening. So what was essentially a public sector driven sort of provisioning of energy access and services to a larger population was changing as the politics and economics and that drove national planning changed back home. And that also, I mean, you're a graduate student, you're in an age where you're also engaging with larger questions and political questions as much as you're engaging with your own work and study. And so this sort of, given that I was working in the energy sector, this became an opening for me to be able to sort of also engage with questions of energy and energy transitions, but in the larger macroeconomic kind of context.
And just to understand the timeline, so this was around 2005 6 when you were dabbling in these kind of questions and started thinking about renewable energy and questions related to energy audits and so on.
Yes,
Okay,
around that
and
time,
when you were
absolutely.
doing the energy audit work, so I was looking at your resume and you said that you've like looked at more than like maybe 3 dozen of these companies where you went and did energy audits. So how was that experience? Was it like working on the ground quite a bit? Did it require also, coming back, crunching those numbers and stuff like that?
Yes, and this was when I was doing my master's degree, and we had this was part of a project in the lab, and it was an ongoing sort of long-term engagement that we were part of. So this was in the New England area. We would go to small, medium-sized industries, and sometimes some sort of sort of larger than medium-sized industries as well. Do a lot of data collection, but it was not just collecting data that was one field, but also talking to operators there, who were operating boilers, say, for example, or furnaces, to look at, because some of the medium scale industries or small scale industries specifically cannot afford the kind of investments required for more efficient operations. And so it was talking to them and then coming back, of course, and putting together a plan that would help them transition to more efficient use of energy and things like that. So it was analysis of numbers, their interpretation of those numbers, and then providing. So it was, in some sense, my first foray into sort of research.
Wow, that's amazing. And this was during your master's.
Yes.
Okay, and then there were like some years spent. There was a time between you did your master's and then you decided to take on the journey of doing, a PhD. So, was there like at some point you felt the need to up your game in some sense, or was there a thing that, oh, if I want to specialize in a specific area, then after a master's, maybe this is the next logical step? So, was there like a specific reason why you, because probably in terms of skills or groundwork, you already had so much experience. So, what was your thought behind at that time thinking of doing a PhD?
Before I did my PhD, I finished my master's and I wanted to come back to India specifically because I did not want to specialize. And I realized that if I continued, I had a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, a master's in mechanical engineering. If I continued to do my PhD there, as I had thought of initially, I would have perhaps become extremely sort of narrowly focused on
Mm,
some area within the field of mechanical engineering, which I did not want to do. I didn't think the kind of questions I would want to work on for 4 or 5 years, let's say, the duration of a PhD. And I wanted to come back home to India to sort of explore the relevant questions here and engage with them. And I didn't therefore want to also, I knew that if I took up a job in industry, it would sort of limit the possibilities of that exploration. I was already interested in wanting to sort of pose questions and answer them,
hmm,
and not sort of simply try and answer questions that were handed down to me.
yeah.
So in that sense, that's why I worked with a think tank on some of these questions. And then I worked as a research fellow in an academic
Hmm,
institution for a while, which allowed me the opportunity to teach. And that made me, that prompted me to do my PhD, because if you have to teach, especially graduate courses, then you have to have a PhD. And I loved teaching. I
That's
love
very
teaching.
interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah, I want to ask you some questions about teaching as well, but just to complete this journey. So I think when you came back to India, it was already kind of end of the first decade in this, I mean, 2009, 10, something like this. And then
I came back in 2006, in fact.
six
So
itself.
the
Okay.
second half of the
Second
first
half of
decade,
the
yes.
first decade, and then you were dabbling in these kind of things that you were quite clear at the time, which is quite amazing, that you don't want to specialize. So this is kind of a surprise. So initially it started with you actually not wanting to specialize, which kind of to me explains your wider reach at this point. It kind of shows. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense now. And but then you started working in an academic institute. So often there are times when people um, who are already like have a master's and come back to an academic institute, and this is true for not just institutes in one country or the other, but people end up finding it too academic. So that somehow didn't happen to you. uh, is there a reason for that, or it was just teaching that kind of completely sealed the deal for you? Because there are people I know who kind of feel a bit constrained in academic environment after they've been out. So somehow this didn't happen to you. So is there a reason for this, you think?
So I think the difference with me was that I went from a purely engineering and STEM kind of an environment into an industrial and then sort of a very sort of think tank kind of environment, and then I came to a social science institute. Now, the where I started, the academic institute I started working at was sort of exploring newer arenas of interdisciplinary work, and it started a center on science and society.
Hmm.
And within that, then eventually we started a center on climate change and sustainability studies, where even in a larger academic institute that was really primarily focused on social sciences, there was a role for the sciences and a role for technology and the intersections that science and technology has with society in some
Hmm.
sense. And so, therefore, it wasn't, in fact, it was emancipating and not constraining for me.
Wow.
In some sense, it allowed me to explore areas of thought and application which I had not thought of before. I met very interesting people from backgrounds in physics, other kinds of engineering, and also the social sciences,
Hmm.
who, in some sense, broadened the scope of what I thought was possible for me to do. And so, in some sense, it led me to choose this as somewhere that I would want to go.
Wow. Okay. So that's amazing. Actually, that speaks well of the institute as well. I mean, institutes evolve, environments change. I guess it also depends a lot on how what kind of people are at a certain point. But it is still encouraging to find out that this can happen, right? Like this complete serendipitous situation where you're surrounded by people who are all trying to come together from different parts of life and achieve something together. And this can happen in academic environment is very encouraging, I think, and that's very nice to know. And then uh, you went on to just to finish kind of the academic journey. So you finished your PhD after that. So of course, PhD itself, you were teaching, you were doing other activities like I mentioned in the introduction. So was it at any point quite challenging to sort of balance things and what you want to focus on, what you don't want to focus on, and things like that? So I mean, I think of you as an extremely independent person, but are there aspects of your PhD where you really thought that, oh, a mentor and advisor is sort of essential for me right now, or, some specific way in which you sought out help, or you had to do things differently just because you're in a PhD program or something like this?
Just to answer the first part of your question, it was challenging because I was working throughout the time, and this was a time when we were starting the course on climate change and sustainability studies in the place where I was working, and so It was, when I was part of designing that course, it was one of the first courses in India on the subject, which was interdisciplinary in nature. So there was a lot of sort of pressure there. And I was teaching. And so, therefore, to juggle both sometimes became a bit of a challenge in terms of time. But I think it was a rich learning experience doing both together, because so much of what I so eventually ended up trying to explore was also discussed in the classrooms that I taught in simultaneously.
That's amazing.
And so that became a very sort of, it was a collaboration, not just with my advisors, but also with my own students at that point of time. And
Wow.
so this was quite a, I mean, it's quite a different experience, but I thought it was a very rich one, and it helped me a lot. And yes, I mean, there were areas in my PhD that I was exploring which were unfamiliar to both. I mean, I had two advisors,
Yeah.
and to both of them, they were unfamiliar, but they were more, they were colleagues rather than, teachers. And so there was a lot of brainstorming that happened together, and it was really collaborative work. And I think that experience, and that is thanks to both my advisors, that has taught me also to engage with my students, graduate students especially, as collaborators rather than, a very typical relationship that you otherwise see in many institutions in across countries actually, but
Yeah.
definitely in India.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And then now with this little bit of benefit of um, now that you can look back, at this path of student, researcher, then teacher, instructor, and guide and advisor, and so on. So this whole trajectory that you have kind of had in the past, can you kind of think of some moments which were defining? Like if at that point something else would have happened, maybe you wouldn't be doing this, or was there like a specific time in your career where you felt, oh, maybe this is not for me, or any either positive or negative?
I think the what comes to mind immediately is after I came back to India and I worked with Prayas for 2.5 years. I decided to leave without anything else in my hand. I didn't know what I wanted to do next, but I knew that the environment there, so within a sort of an NGO slash think tank slash sort of environment, it's constraining. It's constrained by funding. It is, you don't necessarily get to say what you want to say, the way in which you want to say it. And I was always quite politically vocal, so that was important for me. That freedom to be able to say it and to be able to explore areas of research. And so I decided to leave,
Hmm.
even without another opportunity. And I decided I had very little money because I was not getting very paid very well,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
I decided to travel for 4 months. And I traveled to, coal mines, to uranium mines, and met people working in different. And I, my, I met other researchers, people who worked in industry, but mostly I stayed with workers across some of these regions because I was trying to to understand things from different perspectives. There are various lessons I learned in those 4 months. I mean, my money ran out. I came back and I took up a job.
Hmm.
And thankfully, at that point of time, I got one fairly easily. But that sort of decision to leave then
Hmm. Wow.
and to do this, and this is some of the conversations that I had with people in those 4 months was actually what led me to take up the job at that academic institute.
Wow.
So if that wouldn't have happened,
Hmm.
then I don't know what path I would have taken. But it was, in some sense, a defining sort of shift in the way in which I was going about things.
Wow, wow. So I know you for a decade, but there's like so much I don't know about you, right? So that's amazing. Okay, I had no idea you spent these 4 months interacting with workers from different, jobs and different kind of professions. So that's amazing. And just to take the conversation about involvement in politics a bit further, right? Like, so, I mean, I have like a sort of open ended kind of a question, or it's just like my thought. But so you tell me what you think about it. Let me just try to phrase it in a way, and then you tell me what you think about this. Okay, so I'm more interested in your point of view, but let me just put it in some framework so that we kind of get the ball rolling. So, for example, somebody who works in climate research or climate science, the area directly impacts people. So, you know, like, and in fact, our future generations, in fact. And in a way, it's hard to be a climate scientist and not be an activist in some sense. So, you have to advocate for values of equity and so on. But then, so the question is sort of twofold. So, one is like, or the thought is kind of twofold, that when you're just doing your research, somehow it is, though it by itself is a hard task, you feel like there is a direction and there are no natural hurdles. Whereas when one thinks about things from the point of view as an activist, then often you are going to be faced with a lot of disappointments because it involves other people, it involves people with power, people without any power, negotiation between these things. So there's a lot of sort of pushback and disappointment at. I mean, it must be much more in the activism regime than in academic settings. So that's one thing. And then there are still, like, even if I say emphatically that, oh, if you are a climate scientist, you better be an activist, it's not really true. So there are a lot of people who confine themselves to the intellectual pursuit that goes into just doing climate science. So, how do you feel about these two things? One is that activism by itself can be quite discouraging, and so continuing it is hard. And then there are a lot more people kind of not doing it, and in spite of that, trying to continue it. So, how do you feel about these things?
The first part is, I think, what is true of activism as such, and then activism is not really a profession
Yeah.
in some sense, but the fact that you are political and you are assertive about your politics, and it's not just sort of being political in your head and in your room and amongst your friends, but joining movements, joining mass action, and etc., and things like that. So that is what I would consider, in some sense, as an active sort of decision to engage with larger political discourses that also connect definitely with the kind of work you do. It's not necessarily disconnected completely. You can be doing, I can be working on some models, on energy transitions, but I would, there is a constant sort of understanding that I discuss with my students as well, about thinking about how do we incorporate considerations of equity, for example, in the way in which mitigation burdens are distributed, or questions of energy access, or questions of human well-being connected with all of these things. So in that sense, they're not disconnected. But you are right in some sense that uh, there is a pushback, and there is sometimes it is discouraging that you win some, you lose some, especially in political discourse. But the question is, if you are in some sense standing for something that is both scientifically and in terms of the principles of equity and justice valid, then there is that is motivation in itself to sort of continue. The whether or not you win a fight is not really a motivational factor. I think that holds true across the board, because for those who have the most to lose, don't have the luxury of giving up the fight.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the motivation is your conviction that what you're saying is valid and is important in many different ways. And I do think that it is true that it's not, scientists are not some sort of unique alien breed that somehow automatically translate what they know in the lab to social life outside or their own personal lives. Right? They can be as bigoted, as radical, as revolutionary, or as apathetic
Hmm.
as your average citizen. However, you have there is a implicit commitment you make to objectivity, to critical thinking, to skepticism, to when you undertake a scientific endeavor, there is an implicit, if not an explicit, commitment that you have to a rigorous objective scientific endeavor. And so it would just be natural for that to translate into how you view society, and what happens outside of your laboratory. When it, the fact that it does not happen to me is much more unnatural than it actually happened.
Yeah, I
I don't
know
know if that.
what you mean. Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, for example, the first time I encountered a person who was doing a PhD in physics, uh, who also believed, say, for instance, in a higher power that is God and so on, I was super conflicted with the whole thing because, I mean, how can this person who is, trying to discover the mysteries of the universe also have views about things which we probably will scientifically have no backing for, right? So it's kind of this contradiction, and for you, from what I could understand, is this contradiction is all the way. Like if you are thinking about things like climate science, then well, it is part of your life and it kind of percolates into every action you take, and therefore speaking up for it, standing up for the views kind of is a natural part of what you are, in some sense. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, more than a sort of natural part of what you are is there should be there would be, I would think, a burden on you to actually think about these things because you can't unthink them.
Yeah.
And and so if you're not engaging with questions of uh, you know why things appear as they do at all in your every in your professional work, then you're not burdened with trying to answer those questions outside your laboratory because they simply don't appear to you.
Yes.
But once they have appeared to you within the lab, they are bound to appear to you outside the lab as
Hmm.
well.
Absolutely.
And so then unthinking them is not possible. So the only thing that you can do is live with the cognitive dissonance that it would create. And that I think is, there are, I mean, we could go into why that happens, etc. I'm not sure,
Hmm.
I know why it happens, but it does happen. We know people where, and we've heard, and there are many scientists historically and even now who've spoken about why it happens and
Yes.
why, how we should look at it and what is the burden of a collective politics and a collective progressive politics to make sure that this we can transcend these fetters that come from privilege, that may come from sort of not wanting to let go of your own prejudices and privileges that then make you blind to what is so obvious outside of your laboratory.
Yeah, and I feel like even disappointment, though it may, so the way you answered about the disappointment, I thought was like a nice thing, and that's probably exactly how it works for you. It's like you have a north star that you have, like this is the truth, and like that is the bigger goal. So along the way, the disappointments that happen are just like part of life. You have to kind of go ahead with them, but you still have this bigger goal and a clear vision for what you are backing in some sense, and you have full conviction on what you're backing in some sense. So that kind of keeps you going and propels you when there is a setback and so on. But oftentimes I've seen people. So I mean, from whatever limited things I've seen, it may be that there is a little bit of um, you know not 100% in that conviction somehow, and disappointments as a result setting you back more than they should. It may be a combination of the fact that, oh, maybe my conviction is not 100%, it's like 80% in what I believe in, because I also believe in this other point of view which may also be true. So I mean, there could be probably many reasons, and as you said, I mean, all the way from when a king threatens you to sort of kill you, you change your views about whether sun revolves around the earth or earth revolves around the sun. So of course these things are well known, of course. But yeah, I mean, I have to compliment you here that there are few people, there are very few people like you in some sense, and I mean, I have the pleasure of knowing many others like you, but it's still a, in proportion to the number of people who do research, it's a small number, I would say.
I would actually say, Nutan, that it is not about some sort of individual lodestar that you have or individual conviction which is unshaking. All of us, in some sense, learn, realize that we made some mistakes, or perhaps what we thought of is so. In that sense, that is also the process of science,
Hmm.
in some sense. So we have to be open to that. But on the other hand, it is not just some sort of an individual conviction, but the fact that you also then engage
Hmm.
constantly with society, with other people. You engage with other opinions, and even similar opinions, and that's how you sort of go ahead and build consensus. And even when there are disappointments, what you've collected along the way is useful, no? So in that sense, I think the process is much more important
Yeah.
than what an eventual outcome is going to look like. I don't know what the
Yeah.
outcome is,
Yeah.
right? And you don't know, and nobody knows, but the process in itself to try and achieve that outcome itself is an important aspect of the whole thing. And if we commit to the process, then that's good enough.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. And I think this thing that you mentioned is kind of also bringing up another kind of question in my mind. So basically, we started out with your journey and then about activism, your thoughts on that. And while speaking about that, you mentioned that engaging with the society, right? Like, this is a good part of what your intellectual journey has been about. And I would like to ask you a little bit about that. Let's take a short break and we will resume this conversation there.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Um, so, as you know, we have been talking to Tejal Kanitkar, and she has shared her academic journey with us so far and her thoughts about activism. And what I want to next talk about is, in fact, this very thing about engagement with people. So, I think. So basically, I'm going to talk about or ask you questions about science communication and clear writing and clear speaking, etc. But just to get the conversation starting again, let me put out a few open ended remarks and then we can sort of talk about these things. So I think in the recent years across the world, intellectual or experts, these words have become almost like, cuss words, galis. And, typically the image is that of a person sitting in an ivory tower and making public policy decisions without really understanding the grassroots and so on. While on the one hand, we have seen in the recent years how some governments decide to not listen to experts and design public policy, which have been major disasters. Um, so this is, of course, this blind thing about experts being irrelevant is sort of uh, kind of bullshit in my view. But again, the flip side is that there happen to be some people who intend to just sit in these ivory towers indeed and are disconnected from public policy. I mean, make public policy without being fully integrated with the grassroots or having the full understanding of what is required really from the public policy. So uh, there is a little bit of truth in some sense to this sort of a way the intellectuals are being trashed all the time, and a little bit about that also has to do with how academic researchers decide to engage with the society. There is hardly any, popularization of science or even, presenting the thoughts in simplistic ways, trying to bridge gaps, build bridges. So this is sort of kind of lacking from. So this criticism I find slightly correct. So what are your thoughts about how one should engage with the society, how clear writing matters, and so on?
No, while I agree that that both sides you're between a rock and a hard place in some sense, whether you completely dismiss any kind of expertise, which is very fallacious in my opinion, or on the other hand, you put so much stock in expertise that you dismiss any kind of engagement with the ground realities, which is also quite fallacious. So, I mean, having agreed with that, I think part of it is not just a matter of science communication. I think that is an extremely important aspect of it. The scientist definitely needs to be also accessible to a larger public. But if somebody is working on cosmology, for example, and string theory, etc., etc., giving public lectures and making that content accessible is one part of the story. But the very process of inculcating scientific temper in society, or making at creating a public which is really which is critical, which is skeptical, which questions, which asks difficult things of you. I think that is much more important, and that can happen if you sort of do this process has to engage with education, a very diversified education in many ways. So we have affirmative action, for example, across the board in many countries to correct historical injustices, where it concerns gender or race or ethnicities or caste in the case of India. So this is extremely important that your classrooms become much more diverse, that access to this learning. It's string theory is not the domain of a few elites sitting in some corners of the world. Climate modeling is not the teka of a few Europeans sitting, and telling the world that this is how your future is going to look. That's the fact that you need a universalization of knowledge, of modern knowledge, not some, I mean, the fact that there will be some kind of indigenous knowledge, there'll be some kind of traditional knowledge, there'll be some sort of this thing, and then the rich white guys will basically sit and talk about modern science, which rules the roost. The fact that the global south as a whole, and within the global south, different marginalized communities, the access to knowledge
Mhm.
and affecting change through that access to knowledge is I think that is the way, that is what has been uh, missing in, so or we are
Hmm.
progressing extremely slowly, if at all we are progressing. We're taking 2 steps forward and 4 steps back at
Hmm.
in many ways. Universalization of public education, making it accessible, free, in fact, in many places. So this is what I think is much more important than a couple of scientists going out on and giving a few talks on the street. That's useful, but it's not the be all and end all of what it would take to create a society which is which questions, and it's a kind of society, a truly democratic society
Hmm.
that we would want and we envisage for the future.
And I think this thing about 2 steps forward and 4 steps back, I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic about this, but I feel like when I or you were students, perhaps the classrooms were a little more diverse even than they are now. I don't know, maybe because, I mean, you probably get to see today's classrooms because your daughter is now in school, but even otherwise, you may have more knowledge about this than I do. Do you think in India, is it the case that people who kind of became rich in the last couple of decades, our generation people essentially, um, in fact are able to afford schools which are more expensive than what say we our parents were able to afford, and as a result there is much more of this segregation. So do you really think in fact there is a few steps back in this context, really, or?
Absolutely. And I think so, you see a little more, for example, in higher education, you would see that certain communities in India, the Dalits, for example, or women were much less, but definitely much more in proportion as compared to Dalits. Dalits were almost absolutely absent. 50 years and 60 years, 60 years, 60, 70 years now of affirmative action have made a little bit of difference, right? Inadequate, but non trivial. There has been some change. You see some presence now and some assertion in institutes of higher education. But the minute that happens, you have privatization, you have increased fees, you have enormous kind of financial burdens, and so that process in some sense is there is a deterrent for that process to continue. So I agree that in schools we went to the neighborhood schools. That was part of it was affordability. A large part of it was affordability, and the remaining part of it was that those were the only schools. I mean, you had neighborhood public schools, and the few private schools that were there were extremely unaffordable to the middle class.
Yeah.
Now you have a proliferation of private schools. You have a sort of systematic dismantling of government schools, public schools, neglect of these schools where the children of in from poor families still go to. And so you're sort of exacerbating this divide. In higher education, you're going the
Same route almost.
yeah. So so you and what you do in the process is in fact create a barrier for research, creating good researchers. Because what you essentially do is create indentured scholars. You have students in higher education who are so indebted by the time they reach their final year that they are forced to take on jobs that are extremely high paying, which might be extremely mind numbing at times also. You have these engineers from extremely highly ranked schools in India basically selling credit cards for banks. So this is what you and so the research potential, the potential to innovate, to find new things, to all of this potential you sort of suppress by doing this. And I think it's very unfortunate, but this is, I mean, there have to be voices from within academia who push back, who make their disagreement, who put their disagreement on the table and make it clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point. So I was kind of uh, thinking aloud about the role of intellectuals, but you're saying this is more of a, it's not just one intellectual, one researcher that's going to create a dent. But again, unless we do this, maybe the pipeline that feeds into research will actually be affected. So, education in that sense is sort of a problem, a neglect of education is a problem for us going forward if we want to build a steady stream of students coming into research. But again, it's not exactly a question that we as researchers could, by just communicating clearly or something like that, handle at this point. So in that sense, yeah, that's a very, very, very interesting point. But also just
and then
to
so the just to add on a little bit that while we do what we do to ensure outreach of our work and make sure that our work is accessible, we cannot not participate in larger questions of privatization of education, of lack of access, and those questions. Those questions are important, and I think if we just focus on communication and communicating our work and making it accessible, we would be doing only sort of a fraction of what is necessary to
right.
build a good research community.
Yeah, yeah. So the problem that I kind of started with is sort of multi-layered, if I may say so. That clear communication from our side is kind of a prerogative, and I mean, we must. I mean, that's a minimum duty from our side in some sense. But if there is a way to actively engage in a bigger conversation about how we could, I mean, I have personally nothing against having private schools as long as they are not at the expense of taking away resources from government schools and making them less accessible and making them almost unattendable. So there was a study, I think a few years ago, where they just tracked the number of times uh, teachers were absent in public schools. And because absentees on the part of teachers is so accepted, and sometimes teachers are not able to come to their duty just because of the living conditions, both these factors put together, the students are really, out there left to dry. I mean, it's just they don't have access to education at the end of the day, and this is a way bigger problem for us to handle. But just to kind of go back on clear writing, because I know you are such a good speaker and such a good writer yourself, and you write in newspaper columns, you try to talk about what you think about more clearly and make it accessible to people. I know it's something that you actively do. Again, not too many people do this. They should do it, I guess. So, is there like a process when you start designing your talk, or start writing an article or something? Like, your what are your frameworks within which you try to do these things?
No, so I must say that it wasn't very easy to shift from academic writing to, and it isn't easy even now. Although as some of the golden rules I know now, that I don't have to get into the details of the math, for example, when I'm writing a newspaper article, and it depends on the topic. So there are newspaper articles, for example, where I have also gone into the math of behind whatever it is that I'm saying. It's not as if you don't assume that the average reader who is not a subject expert is dumb. So you don't reduce complexity to the extent that you dumb everything down and sort of trivialize. So it's not a you don't make a reductionist argument. At the same time, you make you de-jargonize whatever it is that you're trying to say. You make sure that you're conveying, you have an objective of what it is that you're trying to convey very clearly. You have a particular kind of audience in mind that you're writing for, and there is uh, there is something of relevance that you have to convey why it is relevant to somebody who's reading it. Why is the if I'm writing about the IPCC reports, for example, and what the main findings of the IPCC report are. Now, these are 3,000 page reports. Even the summary is 60, 70 pages. Not everybody is going to be even reading the summary, and you have typical the media picks up headlines, the
Yes.
sensational headlines. But you want to communicate the science, you can't simply focus on the headlines.
No.
But so so what is it that you would want to say based on that? What is it that you want to tell people, in your country? This is what is important here, and this is what we should be thinking about. This is what we should be talking about. And these are things that are read by young people, by
Yeah.
old people alike, by policymakers, by other journalists, by your own peer group. And so it's much more accessible than an academic paper is. And so you are reaching out to a broader audience who might prospectively also then start thinking about some of these things if you make your case persuasively enough. So
Yeah.
but it's not, I must say, it's not always. I mean, I have to do a lot many more revisions of newspaper articles than I have to do of academic papers before
In
I
fact,
finally
that's
submit.
going to be my next question. So, for instance, if you are to write an article, I've seen like churn out an article within sometimes 24 hours of a certain report, big report coming out, and so on. So, it must take a lot of groundwork. And then again, like this communication part where you want to be clear, you don't want to dumb it down, but you still want to communicate. So, how much now, by after years of practice, maybe, or so on, or even when you prepare a talk, right? Like you've given so many public lectures. I can put a link to a bunch of them here, I guess. But so even there, right? You have to deliver some punches. You want to make some points very clear, and then some points in the passing, and so on. So there is a kind of a thought that goes behind the preparation. And time is another thing. Like sometimes you have to speak pretty quickly because the point is relevant now, and like there is going to be some of course these articles are beautiful to read even later, I'm sure, but there is a temporality to it. So in these situations, so what's your kind of formula for coming up with articles, or is there a formula that
Yeah, I don't think I have a formula, but typically when these are issues of immediate relevance, like you say, there is always something that you're writing because you want to say something. And so what is it that you want to say has to be clear.
hmm,
But you can't simply say it. I can't, I mean, it's published as an opinion piece, let's say in a newspaper. But as a scientist, as an expert who is writing, I can't just simply say this is this because I say so. Right?
hmm,
I have to argue for it.
hmm,
So that aspect of argumentation, it's not a proof per se,
yes,
but it's an argument,
hmm,
and that argument can be contested.
yeah,
You have to be open to the fact that it is especially if it's not a sort of a it's a black and white,
hmm,
it's not 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, for example. So it's not that, but there is some argumentation that is involved, and there can be a contestation. So you have to take that into account and make a forceful enough argument. So I think when it comes to the quick, you have to respond
hmm,
quickly.
hmm,
It starts off, you want to respond because you have something to say.
hmm,
And so you start with that.
good,
What is it that you have to say?
very nice,
And then you make sure that you have all the arguments in place to ensure that you're not just simply saying, I'm not some sort of, I'm not God sitting there
yeah,
saying that, this is the truth because I say so.
exactly,
I
and
think this is valid because these are the reasons I think it is valid. But what I want to say has to be upfront and clear.
hmm, that's
That's
it.
the only formula.
Okay, very nice. So it's like when there is a matter of urgent need to communicate, there is often a point that you want to make, and that kind of eases the path a little bit. I'm sure. I'm sure it's quite challenging even then, but okay, that kind of brings it in the realm of what one can possibly do, I guess.
The challenge is not is often to make sure that you're not going overboard with the explanation sometimes,
Hmm.
because you think you are and you have a little more leeway to do that in academic writing. You can write long things. So I remember the first few newspaper articles I wrote, I mean, people I wrote them for said, of course, you're not writing please, is not an academic communication. You're writing for a lay audience, and so there have to be, this is the what you have to say has to be written in the first 2 lines. Your point has to be in the first 2 lines of the article.
Yeah.
Then you explain why you're saying what you are. You
Hmm.
don't start off with laying out the context, the background, the introduction, a literature review, and then no.
Yes. Nobody has. Yeah, I get that. Yes, yes, yes. And in fact, that also brings me to nuanced argument that you have made in the past in your writing and even in your talks about climate studies now. I mean, climate related questions related to India. So I would like to kind of take our conversation a little bit in that direction. So I want to say that, I mean, rather than me telling the listeners about what your nuanced stand on climate action is for should be for India, I would much rather you speak about it. But to put it in a context, it's um, so different countries have different ways of dealing with climate change, and the the thing is that how should India, a country which is quite populous but quite poor, respond to the pressures from the world about cutting down emissions, um, supplying basic commodities to its people, and strike a balance between these things. So, I know that you have a very nuanced view on this particular thing, and I call it nuanced because um, I guess for you, maybe it's already quite obvious and not nuanced, maybe by now, maybe because you've spoken about it so many times, but it is still a view which is kind of hard for people to understand when everybody is like, go green, go cut down emissions, and this is the kind of narrative that's more popular now. So, yeah. Could you?
So let me just begin briefly by saying that there is no doubt that climate change is a global collective action problem, right? And that it's not a matter of one country doing something, another country doing something, unless all of us contribute to mitigating global warming. We are all going to be in a soup, some more than others, of course, because unfortunately, the world is not an equal one. We live in an unequal world. So, our challenge really is trying to find an equitable solution to the problem of climate change in a highly inequitable world. And this is, I mean, I don't have to say it. There are many people came before me have said it, and in fact is enshrined in the principles that govern climate change negotiations in the UNFCCC, for example, the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That we have a common responsibility, but of course it is differentiated. We have, historically, and who is responsible for the emissions is also clearly correlated with who is rich across the world. And so the question about going green, is not straightforward. If it was straightforward, the biggest emitters who have the most means to go green, okay, Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, would have done it. If it is all such a great opportunity, if it is all so easy, why are the people who have the most means to do it, have the highest means to do it, not being able to do it? What are they doing? They've moved from coal to gas, which is also a fossil fuel. The last time I checked, the atmosphere does not discriminate between CO2 molecules that come from one fossil fuel or the other. So in that sense, so it's not an easy, it's part of the discourse that it's become so easy. Renewable energy has become cheap, so you can do this. All of Africa can meet all of its developmental needs by simply putting solar rooftops on each of the roofs. There is no empirical evidence for the fact that this will be possible. So the argument is that the aspirations of 80% of the global population, a large majority of it, which is poor, cannot simply be subsumed or cannot be capped by saying that this is all you need for poverty alleviation. To do our people not have have the right to aspire for more than just not starving and a better life, sustained employment, a better future for their children. And this idea that equity is no longer relevant because inter-country equity or intra-generational equity is no longer relevant, because climate change really is about intergenerational equity. We want to know what's going to happen to our children, what's going to happen to our children's children. But the inequities of today get perpetuated into the future. If our people do not have the means to improve their lot in life today, their children are going to be even more impacted by climate change than the children of those who have the means to do something about it. Right? And then, so the impacts are unequally distributed, and the means to do something about it are also unequally distributed. So, I agree with you that in my view, the argument is not really nuanced. It is simply, it seems nuanced because you have a whole barrage of narrative that is being thrown out that says it's not relevant. This is not relevant. It's possible to do this. It's possible to do that without any proof. Right? And so there is no doubt that climate change is happening. There is no doubt that we need to limit temperature rise. But irrespective, if India decides to give up shut down all of its coal-based power plants, switch off all our lights, ensure that none of our people have anything, those who don't have access to electricity continue to languish in poverty. India sort of shuts down all of its developmental aspirations. It will make a small dent in the total emissions in the world, and we would still be facing the threat of drowning because of sea level rise. Right? Because the largest contributors to the problem, who are responsible for the 1.1 degrees Celsius rise that we see today, are not doing anything about it. have not done anything about it even after they've agreed to do something about it, since the Rio Convention, for example.
Yeah.
Right? And so the argument is very straightforward,
Yeah.
and it doesn't take away from the fights for equality that we have within our countries. But those are our fights. They should not be seen in isolation.
Yeah.
It's but it's a fact that in inter-country inequality is overwhelmingly higher as compared to intra-country inequality. Even the poorest in rich countries consume more than the middle class in in fact, some of the richest in some of the poor countries. Because it's simply a matter of infrastructure, buildings, hospitals, schools.
Yeah.
It's not this thinking of energy consumption as simply luxury. I think it has so overwhelmed the sensibilities of everybody that you forget that the reduction of drudgery, the fact that you get water in your house and you don't have to walk 5 kilometers to fetch it, that you can have sanitation within your house, that you have schools and hospitals where you have increased life expectancy, is all a result of modernity. And you can't simply say that it is bad.
Yeah.
We are where we are today because of it. And the response to climate change, the solution to climate change, an inequitable solution to climate change, has to come from modern science, which recognizes the importance of equity, as it has done in the past.
Yeah.
Science has been equalizing in some sense in history, and that is the role that it has to play today as well.
Yeah.
Which and that's really the argument from the global south, and that's definitely from India.
Yeah, in fact, I had sort of, because I know your view on this, I had kind of created what shall I say, like fake pushbacks, because fake in the sense of I kind of premeditated them already. And one of them was about, but what would you say about rich people in India? They may be consuming as much as maybe a middle class person in somewhere in the West. Then don't you think that therefore at least that section of the society should pay extra for its emissions and so on? And I think you already sort of answered this, but maybe I will ask you to expand a little bit, because it's, again, to me, who doesn't think about this all the time, is a nuanced argument. What you're trying to, if I understood you right, you're trying to say is that even if we sort of bring down the emissions of people who are sort of rich, and maybe we should do that, that's an internal conversation worth having, of course, as per what you said. But even if we did that, the dent it makes compared to um, uh, overall emissions in the world is so minuscule that it's a conversation we should have only after a few other things are sort of taken care of. Is that fair to say?
I don't think it's a question of before or after.
Hmm.
I think that's an ongoing conversation. Talking about inequality is an ongoing conversation within countries and regions as well. But it is not necessarily related to the environmental question only. It is related to a whole lot of other things, and a more equitable society is, irrespective of whether or not climate change was happening, is a desirable thing. And so therefore that is definitely something that we must strive for. But this entire argument that, one is, of course, the numbers don't hold. The If you look at intra-country inequality versus inter-country inequality, it's inter-country inequality is much higher, right? And there are multiple publications that have said this, and I've said this again, that the poorest in the US, for example, end up consuming more than the richest decile in India. It's simply because of the kind of, because what is consumption? It's not necessarily an individual choice.
Yeah.
Right? Consumption is an artifact of structural conditions and things like that, and those conditions themselves are so vastly different.
Yeah.
In the global south versus the global north, that it is, there are estimates that show that the consumption of a typical middle class, not even the rich in the US, of one refrigerator in the US, in California, is more than the entire annual per capita consumption of some countries in Africa.
Wow.
Just one refrigerator. So that's the kind of disparity we are talking about internationally. And so it's just, in my opinion, it's a red herring to divert the conversation to intra-country inequality, which is not by any means an irrelevant conversation. But the relevance of that conversation is not contingent on climate change happening. It is important, it's an important and relevant and in fact essential conversation, even otherwise, for all of the reasons that we spoke about, right? Education, research,
Yeah.
those are removed from climate change. Those issues remain relevant. But when it comes to climate change, because we're talking about CO2, it's not even a local environmental pollutant, it's not traditionally in that traditional sense a pollutant. We are talking about questions of industrialization, and things like that. And so industrialists or capital or the rich in India are still rich in a poor country.
Yeah.
They do not have the kind of military backing that so capital in India, for example, doesn't have the kind of military backing that capital in the US has, right? And Elon Musk is very different from an Indian capitalist, an Indian innovator. So in that sense, we are talking about very different things. And to confound the conversation, and I do think that it is confounding the conversation, because it's simply empirically not true that this is much more important. It's much more important, like I said, for very different reasons. And that conversation is our business to have. It's not an international prerogative.
Yeah.
Right? The US, for example, is very fond of bringing democracy to different countries. We do not want it to bring equality to different countries. We can manage and fight our own inequalities. And it must be on our agendas to fight.
Yes.
But that's a different conversation.
Very nice. Very nice. So I think this is really good. And I understand it a bit more now, in the sense of, for example, what you said about this one refrigerator, right? It's a very it's like a show don't tell kind of a example, right? Like it's a stark example. For example, does it, just to understand it a little better, not that specific example, but why a person who's living, say, in the Western world would be emitting more per capita is because, for example, if I work in a building which is centrally heated, for instance, for the entire winter, then my emissions are basically, counted. My emissions, you will account that on my head in some sense, the amount of heating per. If there are 1,000 people using the building, then it's whatever by 1,000, and I take the onus of that. So it's these things that also quickly add up for Western countries. Is that right?
It is floor space, for example, the kind of houses, the size of the houses that you live in, the road infrastructure, the kind of buildings that are built, So basically, modern infrastructure is energy intensive.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, it adds up together to a much higher per capita energy use, which is, forget rural India or rural Africa. Even the slums in the urban urban India and urban Africa do not consume that kind of energy. Forget them. Even the middle class doesn't consume that kind of energy, simply because we are so structurally different. There was an article by an American academic some years back, a few years back, about aviation thing. So he was basically an associate professor in a university in the US. And he was saying how if we cut down, our air travel, etc., we can cut down so many emissions. So I use so many. So he given his own example. He had basically detailed how much energy he uses. Now, I'm also an associate professor, in a public university in India. He uses 16 times more energy than I do. And this is not some profligate, rich, spoiled American.
No.
This is your standard associate professor. I am not a poor, below poverty line Indian. I am, in fact, amongst the top 10% of earners in India. Right? An associate professor. But he uses 16 times more energy than I do. Wow. You're not even comparing the poor and poor or the rich and rich. You're comparing, in fact, what is possible to compare here.
Yeah.
And there's still a huge difference, simply because structurally we live in different kinds of housing. We use car travel less. We don't travel by air as much. we holiday differently. There is a whole
Yep.
range of things that change. And we have access to lesser amenities than they do,
Yes.
which they take for granted
Granted.
as a necessity. So for him, it was only air travel which was unnecessary. But everything else from dishwashers, washing machines, etc., was a necessity. Whereas when they talk about us, they consider even washing machines as a luxury. So that is where the I think that disparity is. So you don't even have to give the refrigerator example a star.
Yeah.
But when you're comparing even comparable
Commodities or
situations,
yeah, lifestyle. Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's still quite a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have another kind of a fake pushback to this point of view again. So, just so that, this point of view becomes clearer in some sense, but let's go ahead with it. So, one could say that, oh, India is so populous. So, this could be another thing, like, oh, country like India and China, I mean, they shouldn't even be compared in my view. But, in terms of just population, these are like the two leading populous countries. And if India doesn't, say, um, cut down now and progresses, then there's going to be far more emissions that will happen. So, does this sort of an argument stand any ground?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is this argument is very surprisingly still very popular
Yeah,
and
that's
very
why I.
shamelessly touted. Even though it is, I mean, I say shamelessly because it is discredited
Hmm.
quite thoroughly.
Hmm.
This Malthusian understanding that population, and it keeps reappearing in the environmental literature, in the climate change literature, unfortunately, in a completely uncritical manner. Even though it is very clear, for example, that even in the last 30 years, the maximum increases in emissions have come from places where the rises in population have not been maximum. And it is also proven that population is not an independent variable, it is dependent on development.
Yeah.
Right? And so the more development you have, your population growths stabilize. And so therefore, you cannot hold the poor responsible for future runaway climate change, where when you yourself have been responsible for, where just 20% of the population is responsible for more than 60% of the emissions. Yeah. So it's not even, I mean, sometimes I find responding to this argument also quite funny,
Yeah.
because any academic, worth his name or her name, would know that this is a complete misrepresentation of what is the issue. Are you saying, for example, that a large number of people need to be fed, need to be housed, need to be clothed, and so therefore you need more energy? Of course you do. You are going to need more energy for this. Then let's find ways to do this without increasing emissions. That's our prerogative. But you cannot turn back and say that because there are more people, you are going to have more energy. So what are you saying? That you have less people, kill off people? You're saying that population growth is responsible for biodiversity loss. I mean, this is like holding the poor, when it is established that it is the levels of development that drive population. You're basically holding the poor responsible for environmental degradation and all kinds of climate change and all kinds of other things. I mean, it is it is quite significant. Then you might as well say that if you have lesser population, so you have pogroms and you have events that decimate large amounts of population growth, and that's going to be good for climate change. Because the converse is so perverse of that argument that it doesn't even bear thinking about.
Yeah, and
So
having said that, then like you said, like these arguments, which are kind of almost cringeworthy, keep coming back into popular discussions or in even science discourse. Do you think there is a reason for this, and that whatever is to has to be done? It's easy to pass the buck in some sense, and then like it avoids some self-reflection in some strong actions within, and then for example, no government is going to be popular for inconveniencing its people, and somehow the argument of cutting down is again falsely linked to inconvenience rather than innovation coupled with maintaining the lifestyle, etc. So do you think this is sort of Uh, this may be the reason why some of these um, cringeworthy arguments circle back somehow.
Part of it is definitely that it is, it is it's a form of privilege that you can control a discourse, and then you would control even a discredited discourse, and so and perpetuate a discredited discourse. And this we've seen in science, no? I mean, multiple times. There's a reason why the US sort of championed climate change denial for so long, or vaccine hesitancy, or all kinds of. So you see this in multiple aspects
Yeah.
of scientific thought. It's not just climate change, and so it is. It comes from a place of privilege, definitely, that you can do this. But it often gets, and like with a lot of other things like discrimination,
Yeah.
racism, etc., it gets, the discourse is so entrenched that it gets absorbed uncritically by a lot of people. So you would hear the population argument even from those it hurts the most,
Yeah.
and who should know better and should, in fact, counter it. But they would uncritically accept it because it becomes the dominant narrative.
Yeah. And this, I mean, given the current times, managing narrative seems like the only action that people seem to
Fortunately.
take. So that's kind of disastrous as a result. And I think, therefore, people like you should continue to speak in the most clear terms that you do. And that's wonderful. So I'm kind of trying to wrap up here now. It was wonderful, and I know that you are sort of close to your deadline you gave me. But before I let you go, I have a kind of a lighter segment for the end. So I don't want to call it rapid fire because it's too cliched, but it's a non-rapid fire as a result. I just ask you like some quick questions. You don't have to give quick answers, um, and then we at the end of that we end. 5 questions. Okay. So if you were to do another PhD, what would it be in?
Wow. Uh, Maybe economics.
Hmm, very interesting. Is this because you want to? Is this like? Is there an agenda here?
Actually, I do a lot of economics in my
Hmm.
work. And in fact, in my PhD also, I did. I mean, it's not as if I didn't use
Yeah.
theory from there, but I've never had any formal training in it.
Hmm.
And I feel like a bit of a fraud when I teach some of it in in the classroom. So, so maybe that's why.
Good. 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 That's perfect. I think it would be great if you did. Even if without doing it, if you like started diving deep into it, I'm sure already you'll do a lot. So the next question: do you have a book in you?
Perhaps I do. I would like to write a
Uh,
whole book.
okay. About what then?
So immediately, of course, what comes to mind is one is this climate change
Hmm.
from a global south perspective, right? And
Yeah.
how is it that we should look at it? And I've written book chapters, I've written papers about it, but maybe writing the whole story myself is something that I would like to do. But the other thing, which is not academic, is I told you that I did this sort of, I roamed around and I took
Hmm.
some time, a few months off, and
Yeah.
met so many people. And I met so many interesting people,
Hmm.
and had, I learned so much during that time. Some of those experiences I would like to put, before I forget and I become
Hmm.
senile, I would want to put some of that down on paper. I don't know when I'll have the time to do it, but I would like to do that.
I think you becoming senile is a long way ahead, but yeah, it would be great to have a book sooner. Okay, then the next question. One thing you would like to do more as a researcher? That, I mean, more of.
Um, No, sometimes, where I am right now, for example, I don't. I would like very much to be able to teach more diverse classrooms. When I started off, I was teaching classrooms which had engineers, science graduates, English literature students, history students, etc. That's not something I have now. I mean, I'm teaching largely science and STEM students. But teaching that kind of a class is very, very challenging and very exciting and interesting. And I would like to go back to doing something like that again. I mean, most immediately. In
Nice.
terms of exploring more questions, I mean, that's an endless list
That's an
that I
endless.
think
Yeah.
everybody
And
has.
I think if you state a proper question, I won't even understand. So I think let's not talk about that.
Yeah, that's a long list, and I wouldn't know where to begin. So
No. This is wonderful. And then, what would you like to do less of as a researcher?
invigilate exams and grade papers.
Yeah,
Not as a researcher, that's more as a teacher, but
yeah,
I
yeah. That's a
prefer
part of
grading
our
a little
life, which
less.
is kind of yeah. I agree. And then, do you have? Okay, so this is like the final question, but it doesn't have to be anything specific. But do you have like advice for students who will be starting out, or even if not proper advice, like okay, you should read these books, or get inspired by these conversations, or like any recommendations, or just pure advice to somebody who may be starting out now?
Um, People who are starting off in graduate studies, I would, my what I tell my own students when they start off is that they should use the opportunity to read things that are not related to
Hmm.
their research, because those things they're going to read anyway.
Hmm.
But this is the time that you get to actually, branch out and read other things. Read literature, read, nonfiction, read history, read politics, engage with these debates, because they inform much larger. They inform your research in many different ways, but also how you approach
Yeah.
your research and your professional life later. So this is what I mean. I did courses on radical politics in the third world when I was doing my master's and things like that. So do that.
Hmm.
Go and do things that that are outside of your academic comfort zone, but they're academic nevertheless.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
so
that's great
that was.
advice. Actually, that had helped me as well. Like when I did other courses, it just helps you form opinions. It helps you, make sense of the world, because at that age also you are kind of putting everything together, right?
Right, right.
Yeah. That's great advice. That's great advice. Thanks. So, Tejal, I have to let you go because you have to go now. But
Yes,
it was
but it's
a.
been a long. Every conversation with you is it generally can be endless. We can go
Usually
on.
we have it over beverages, but okay, we did
Yes.
well without them, I think. Thanks a lot for your time today. And thank you to
For
the
having me.
listeners who tuned in to listen to us. And bye bye for now.